Chapter 9 of The Girls of Friendly Terrace by Harriet Lummis Smith. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 9. Peggy Acts as Critic. Peggy's thoughts, busy with plans for the relief of the Dunn family, were turned abruptly into another channel at the supper table. "Oh, by the way, Peggy," her mother said, "you had a caller this afternoon, Mrs. Summerfield Eli." "She came in a naughty mobile," exclaimed Dorothy, almost choking over the long word in her eagerness to get it out before anybody else had a chance. "My, doesn't she think she's swell?" scoffed Dick. "Fur coat and a dress that trails." Of all manifestations of feminine vanity, a trained gown called forth from Dick the most outspoken expressions of contempt. "It seems," explained Mrs. Raymond, ignoring her son's outburst, "that she was at your bazaar and bought a collar, Irish lace, I believe." "Oh, yes, Mother. That was Elaine's collar. I was a little worried for fear nobody would buy it, but not because it wasn't nice enough. I was afraid it was too nice. Lots of people come to our bazaar with just about 50 cents to spend, and I was sure the price of the collar would look dreadfully big to nearly everybody, but we really couldn't mark it less than it was worth." "Certainly not," agreed Mrs. Raymond. "And then Mrs. Summerfield Eli came in, and I was sure the collar was as good as sold, for it was really the nicest thing there, Mother. Just as soon as I could get the chance, I called her attention to it, and she looked at it a minute through her lorgnette." "Oh, say," sneered Dick, "why doesn't she wear spectacles if she needs them?" "And she said right off, 'I'll take that,'" continued Peggy tranquilly. "I was so glad, especially on Elaine's account. It makes you feel horrid to put lots of work into a thing and have it left over." Having relieved her mind, Peggy was now ready to listen to other people. "What did Mrs. Eli want of me, Mother?" "She wants to order a pair of cuffs to match the collar. She wasn't sure who did the work, but she thought you could tell her. I am very glad," added Mrs. Raymond, "for, of course, she will pay a good price, and from what you tell me, I fancy that Elaine needs the money." "Why, what are you going to do, Peggy?" The impulsive Peggy, starting up from her unfinished supper, blushed guiltily and sat down again. "I was going to run over and tell Elaine," she confessed, "but I suppose the news was few." As it turned out, it was not till the next afternoon that Peggy found an opportunity to convey to her next-door neighbor the important information of Mrs. Summerfield Eli's order. Callers came before supper was over, and by the time they left, the lights in the next house were extinguished. When Peggy presented herself at Elaine's door at the close of school the following day, she was as relieved at the prospect of delivering her news as if it had been a heavy weight which she had been carrying about for 24 hours. Told in Peggy's glowing language, the rather commonplace announcement took on life and color. Even the multiplication table, repeated with such animation, and such assurance of the complete sympathy of one's listeners, would have seemed touching and impressive. But when Peggy had finished, she was aware of a sudden drop in the temperature. Without meaning to do it, she intercepted glances passing between Elaine and her mother, which impressed her as the very reverse of enthusiastic. "It's very kind of you, Peggy," Elaine said at length, her manner distinctly apologetic. "Awfully kind to be so interested. But you see," she hesitated, and again the thermometer seemed to drop several degrees. "But you see, doing work like that for pay is very different from doing it for charity." "Oh, very different," said Mrs. Marshall in her deepest voice. "Of course it's different," admitted Peggy, frankly bewildered. "But it's nice to earn money for yourself, isn't it?" Again, the perplexing exchange of glances gave her a feeling of being a hopeless outsider. "Oh, the money's all right," Elaine admitted with a hard little laugh. "Nobody could want it much more than I do. But to earn it like a sewing woman—" "Fortunately," Mrs. Marshall broke in, "there are other avenues. My daughter has hopes of making a comfortable income in a manner less unsuited to her position in life." "Oh, indeed." Peggy looked at Elaine with the respect due to the prospect, whose magnificence was suggested by Mrs. Marshall's manner rather than her words. To her surprise, Elaine was blushing and looking very uncomfortable. "Oh, please, Mama," she murmured appealingly. "Elaine's literary gift," continued Mrs. Marshall complacently, "has been most pronounced since childhood. A former governess, Miss Brown, Elaine always called her Brownie, was most enthusiastic over her early attempts. I think, my dear, that she compared some of your first efforts to the writings of—" "Sometimes I wonder," broke in Elaine, with a noticeable increase of color, "if Brownie didn't say all those flattering things just because she thought we liked to hear them." "Upon my word, Elaine," exclaimed Mrs. Marshall indignantly. "Such suspicion is very unbecoming, especially in a young girl. And Miss Brown is so sincere, so unaffected, so different from that disagreeable Miss Collier, who was always criticizing everything and everybody. Such a relief as it was to get that woman out of the house." "She didn't think me much of a genius, that's certain." Elaine laughed a little, apparently at some recollection whose humor increased with distance. "But I'm not so sure," she added immediately, "that she didn't mean every word of it." "Really, Elaine?" Mrs. Marshall's irritation showed itself by a sudden flushing of her sallow cheeks. "You are in a very singular mood today. If you are going to run down poor dear Brown and uphold that dreadful Miss Collier, I don't know, but my turn will come next." She drew out her handkerchief rather ostentatiously, and then the awkwardness of the moment was relieved by the arrival of the postman. Elaine, hurrying to the door, returned with full hands and an expression of countenance anything but enthusiastic. "What a lot of mail!" exclaimed Peggy, thankful for so good an opening for changing the subject. "Yes, there's enough of it, such as it is," Elaine responded discontentedly. She slammed the postman's offering down on the table. "2 bills, no, 3, and the others." "A young author has much to contend with," said Mrs. Marshall, forgetting her momentary pique in sympathy. "There is a prejudice against the newcomer, but once get a hearing, and it is all plain sailing." Peggy eyed the long envelopes on the table with sudden understanding. They were returned manuscripts. Very businesslike they looked with the row of stamps on the right-hand corner, and even sensible Peggy was thrilled for the moment by something vaguely impressive in the thought of writing for publication. "I'm sure a great many authors had a discouraging experience to begin with," pursued Mrs. Marshall. "Wasn't it Milton who sold Paradise Lost for a mere song? And I'm sure David Harrow was refused by any number of publishers." She looked anxiously at Elaine, who, having opened one of the long envelopes after another, was reading over the rejection slips, her forehead creased in an unmistakable frown. "Let me see." Mrs. Marshall secured a slip and perused it carefully. "Why, this is rather encouraging. They say that the rejection does not imply any lack of merit." "But they must say that to everybody," Elaine insisted gloomily. "It's printed." "Really, Elaine, if you're determined to take a pessimistic view, read one of the stories to Peggy," cried Mrs. Marshall, forgetting formality for once, "and see what she thinks." Peggy echoed the suggestion heartily. She was really very curious about the contents of those long envelopes. "If I did, it would be to find out what you really did think about them," Elaine replied. "Most people would say nice things anyway. But I believe you'd be honest, Peggy." She looked at her friend rather appealingly. "I don't want to waste my time on what isn't going to amount to anything." Peggy felt a marked decline of enthusiasm. "Of course, I'm not any critic," she said uncomfortably. "I can tell you what I think, but that won't be worth much." "It's what I want anyway." Elaine jerked a bulky manuscript from its sheath and settled herself in a rocking chair. "The name of this," she announced in a defiant voice, "is The Maid of the Haunted Well. It's a story for children." "Oh, yes." Peggy leaned forward in an attitude of close attention, while Elaine began to read with a rapidity which gave small heed to the marks of punctuation. "Long ago, on the edge of a vast and mighty forest, lived a young girl, known far and near as the Maid of the Haunted Well. Fair she was, with lustrous golden hair that fell in a profusion of silky ringlets, deep blue in her eyes. Far and wide had the fame of her loveliness spread, and many came to see for themselves if she was as ravishingly beautiful as she was reported to be." "How wretchedly you are reading, Elaine," remonstrated her mother. "It is impossible to get any idea of the real excellence of the story when you hurry that way." With an evident effort, Elaine slackened her speed and continued. "The Maid of the Haunted Well had hosts of lovers, but to one and all she gave one answer. Wouldst wed me, then drink with me 1 cup of water from the haunted well. Whosoever tastes this water shall never—" The monotonous voice ceased suddenly, and the sheets comprising the Maid of the Haunted Well strewed the carpet like gigantic snowflakes. "Elaine!" cried Mrs. Marshall. "I can't go on with it. It chokes me. Peggy, don't you think it's silly?" Peggy's struggle between her candor and her sympathy resulted in something of compromise. "I didn't know just what you were trying to bring out about the haunted well," she replied, "but it sounded rather ingenious and interesting. At the same time—" "Well?" It was Mrs. Marshall who insisted on the conclusion of the sentence. Elaine was staring gloomily at the carpet. "Oh, I only wondered if nice breezy stories about jolly boys and girls wouldn't take a little better, but, of course, I don't know anything about it." "They are not all children's stories," said Mrs. Marshall as Elaine preserved an uncompromising silence. "Read her The Daughter's Defiance, Elaine." For a moment Peggy feared Elaine was going to refuse. She looked ruefully at the dejected figure in the rocking chair, wondering if her frankness was likely to cost her the friendship she had worked so hard to win. But, after a moment, Elaine reached automatically for another envelope and drew out a second manuscript. "The Daughter's Defiance," she read, or "True in Spite of All." Peggy tightened her grip on the arms of her chair and prepared herself for the worst. "Leave me if you have any mercy, I pray you leave me to myself." The Countess Rosalie stood trembling, her hands flashing with jewels, clasped in appeal. Beautiful as she always was, she seemed more beautiful than ever, now that grief had left her cheeks white as alabaster. There was a ring at the doorbell. Peggy hurried to collect the scattered sheets of The Maid of the Haunted Well, while The Daughter's Defiance found a temporary hiding place behind one of the couch cushions. Before the scramble was over, the bell had rung for the second time, and Elaine, looking self-conscious almost to the point of guilt, went to answer it. Peggy heard a surprised exclamation, then a small voice piping resolutely, "Want my Aunt Peggy." Even Mrs. Marshall joined in the laughter. "Oh, Dorothy," cried Peggy as her niece appeared, wearing an expression of triumph. "To think of all that excitement just for you." She put her arms about the little figure fondly. "What do you want, honey?" "Want to stay with you." "If you stay, you must be as still as a little mouse. I'm listening to a story." "I like stories." Dorothy climbed upon Peggy's knee and composed herself to listen. But long before the harrowing adventures of the Countess Rosalie had reached their tragic culmination, she had grown restless. Slipping from Peggy's arm, she started on a tour of investigation of the room and its contents. And to be quite honest, Peggy half wished she might follow her example. But the Countess Rosalie was finally at peace, and Elaine turned a flushed face on her unwilling critic. "Tell me just what you think of her," she said. Peggy drew a long breath. The temptation to be comforting and complimentary was for the instant almost irresistibly strong. She fortified herself for the ordeal by recalling the character of Elaine's appeal. It was not right that the girl should waste her time if a friendly caution would save her. Nevertheless, Peggy heartily wished that the thankless task had fallen to somebody else. "Of course, it's any amount better than anything I could write, Elaine. I think your imagination is really wonderful, but—" "Go on." This time it was Elaine who did the prompting. Mrs. Marshall only compressed her lips. "It seemed to me that there were a good many things in your story that girls can't be expected to know much about. Love and crime and remorse and all that sort of thing. And all the characters are counts and countesses and, well, I never saw a countess." "And you're wondering if I ever did? Well, no." "I should think," suggested Peggy, feeling the beads of perspiration start on her forehead, "that it would be better to write about the things you know, that's all." "But I don't know anything worth writing about," said Elaine sharply. Then in a changed voice, "Oh, I see. Probably that's just the reason I oughtn't to try it." "It seems to me," floundered Peggy, wondering how editors ever lived through the ordeal of rejecting manuscripts, "that after you've lived longer—" "I believe," interjected Mrs. Marshall witheringly, "that Bryant wrote Thanatopsis at 18. "I believe he did," Peggy acknowledged meekly. "But this isn't Thanatopsis," said Elaine, surveying The Daughter's Defiance with a critical eye. "And I'm not Bryant. That's all Peggy means." She smiled with a courage that did not conceal a quiver of pain, and Peggy looked at her with a contrition no less keen, because she herself felt the need of sympathy. Again, a welcome diversion came from Dorothy. In her search for entertainment, she had discovered a basket of photographs placed upon a small stand. Engrossed in the possibilities of her discovery, Dorothy had leaned against the basket's frail support, with the result that the stand was overturned and the pictures strewn far and wide. For the second time during her call, Peggy went down on hands and knees to gather up the scattered photographs, having satisfied herself by the agility with which Dorothy scrambled to her feet that she was uninjured. "Oh, Elaine!" It was a relief to start a topic of conversation which bore no relation to literary pursuits. "Here's a picture of you I never saw before." Elaine glanced up quickly. "Oh," she exclaimed, "I didn't know that was downstairs." Peggy's discovery was a Kodak picture, apparently a group of picnickers gathering on the edge of a small lake. When she had removed all traces of the disorder caused by Dorothy's mishap, she carried the picture to the window for a closer look. "How heavy your hair used to be, Elaine. You've got plenty now, but it was lots heavier then." No reply. "I love Kodak pictures," Peggy went on. "This is an awfully cute one, but really, you look older in it than you look now. I suppose it is because there's no retouching." Something in the other's silence caused her to look up. Elaine's face was crimson, and her manner so indicative of perturbation that Peggy was on the point of demanding the reason. Elaine saved her from that blunder. "It's not a bit good picture," she said hastily. "I can't bear it. I never mean to leave it where people can see it." She took the offending photograph from Peggy's hand and had locked it into the drawer of the desk before Peggy had recovered from her amazement. On the whole, the afternoon had not been very successful. Peggy suggested to Dorothy that it was time to go home, and Dorothy pranced with uncomplimentary readiness to take her departure. Elaine followed them out into the hall, half closing the door behind them. "Peggy," she said with an unmistakable effort, "if it isn't too much trouble, I wish you'd tell Mrs. Eli that I'll do those cuffs for her." Peggy turned with a joyful exclamation and caught Elaine in her arms. "You dear thing, I think that's just splendid of you." Then, without giving her courage time to cool, she rushed on. "And oh, Elaine, you don't know how I hated to say what I did. You'll forgive me, won't you?" "I shouldn't have forgiven you if you'd said what you didn't believe," Elaine returned, her lips trembling. "I didn't want sugar plums, Peggy. I wanted the truth. I've got to do something to earn money, and if I haven't any chance one way, I've got to try another. And besides," she added, voicing a truth which many people apparently lose sight of, "it's a lot easier always to say something pleasant than to say what's true." Peggy went home in a glow. She was proud of the stand Elaine had taken, and grateful to her for realizing that friendly sincerity may be a costly gift. And she's such a sensitive girl, too, Peggy thought. She was really annoyed because I didn't quite like the Kodak picture of her. The recollection of Elaine's face came before her as the thought took shape, and she seemed to see in its expression something more than annoyance. Why should Elaine have cared? Unconsciously, Peggy laid the matter of the photograph away in some secret drawer of her memory, along with several other little perplexities, to await a future solution. End of chapter 9.